My life had always been one of structure and discipline, an approach that served me well both professionally and personally. I was a man who valued routine, who found solace in the predictable rhythms of a well-ordered life. And for a long time, I believed that my marriage to Megan was the pinnacle of that stability. Megan and I had met in college, back when life was simple and the future was filled with endless possibilities. She was the perfect balance to my meticulous nature, vivacious, spontaneous, with a wild streak that added color to my otherwise black and white world. We married young, just after graduation, and while our lives grew busier with time, our bond seemed unshakable. Or so I thought. I worked my way up in a mid-sized tech firm, eventually landing a position as the regional manager. The role came with long hours and significant responsibilities, but I relished the challenge. Megan, meanwhile, had taken a job as an HR specialist at a large corporation, but left work after our first child was born. She embraced the role of a stay-at-home mom with enthusiasm, managing our household and raising our two boys, Tyler and Jason. For the longest time, life felt complete. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but there was a rhythm to our days that I found comforting. Work was demanding, but I made it a point to be home for dinner as often as possible. Weekends were sacred, family outings, barbecues, lazy Sundays with the kids. It was the kind of life I'd always envisioned. But then, subtle changes began creeping into our relationship. They started off so small that I didn't notice them at first. Megan, who had once been so warm and affectionate, became more distant. She'd spend hours on her phone, often smiling at something she wouldn't share with me. When I asked, she'd brush it off with a vague explanation. Just catching up with an old friend, or a funny meme from a mom group. Her laughter, once so infectious and shared with me, became quieter, more private. She began dressing up more often, even when she wasn't going out. The compliments I gave her seemed to bounce off her, leaving her untouched, uninterested. Conversations that used to flow easily between us became stilted, peppered with awkward silences and curt responses. Then there was her newfound interest in my boss, Richard. We'd hosted a company event at our home last year, and Megan had been charming and gracious as always. But in the months that followed, she seemed to bring Richard up in conversation more than I was comfortable with. Richard said this, or Richard thinks that, she'd casually mention, as though they were old friends. At first I chalked it up to politeness. After all, Richard was my boss, and Megan had always made an effort to be cordial with my colleagues. But it became increasingly apparent that her interest in him went beyond mere politeness. She'd ask about his personal life, his family, things she never cared much about before. It was as if she was suddenly fascinated by the man, and the more she talked about him, the more unsettled I felt. Yet I pushed these thoughts aside. Megan had never given me a reason to doubt her before. We'd been together for nearly 2 decades, and our trust was something I took pride in. But as the months wore on, the unease in the pit of my stomach grew. It was a gnawing feeling, a sense that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. There was one incident that stood out, a night when Megan returned home later than usual. She claimed she had been out with her friends, but her explanation was vague, and her eyes didn't meet mine when she spoke. When I pressed her for details, she became defensive, accusing me of being paranoid. "You're just imagining things, Eric," she'd said, her voice sharp. "I'm allowed to have a life outside this house, you know." I let it go, not wanting to stir up unnecessary conflict, but the seed of doubt had been planted. From that point on, I couldn't help but notice the small things. The way she'd glance at her phone and quickly put it away when I entered the room. The mysterious phone calls she'd take in the other room. Her sudden disinterest in sex. But it was her behavior around Richard that truly made my skin crawl. There was a dinner at a high-end restaurant where she had insisted on joining me, something she usually didn't care for. Throughout the evening, her attention seemed divided between me and Richard. She laughed at his jokes a little too hard, leaned in a little too close when speaking to him, and her eyes sparkled with a familiarity that didn't belong in a professional setting. My suspicions deepened, but I was still in denial, clinging to the belief that Megan wouldn't betray me. That's when I decided to take a more direct approach. If there was something going on, I needed to know. One evening, after the kids were in bed and Megan had gone out for one of her girls' nights, I found myself pacing the living room, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't confront her without proof, but the uncertainty was driving me insane. So I did something I'd never done before. I checked her phone. It was a violation of her privacy, something I had never considered doing before. But the desperate need for answers overpowered my guilt. As I scrolled through her messages, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were the usual group chats with her friends, reminders for the kids' activities, and the occasional meme exchange. Just when I thought I might be wrong, that maybe I was just being paranoid, I found it. A chat labeled under a pseudonym I didn't recognize. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened the thread. The messages were coded, nothing explicit, but the undertones were clear. There were mentions of meetings that didn't align with her usual schedule, references to places I didn't recognize. And then, there was a message that made my blood run cold. Tonight was amazing. Can't wait for the next time. The name at the top of the chat wasn't Richard's, but I knew it was him. The puzzle pieces started to click into place, forming a picture I had refused to see. Megan wasn't just fascinated by my boss, she was having an affair with him. I sat there in the dark, her phone still in my hand, my mind a storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion. How could she do this to me, to our family? How long had it been going on? Had everything we built together been a lie? As the questions swirled in my mind, one thing became painfully clear. My life was about to change forever. The days that followed my discovery were a haze of conflicting emotions. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was confused, lost in a sea of disbelief. Megan had been my rock, the woman I'd trusted with my life. The idea that she could betray me with my boss of all people. It was a reality too twisted to accept. I spent hours replaying every interaction between us over the last few months, scrutinizing each word, each glance, looking for the signs I'd missed. There were so many little moments that I had brushed aside, so many red flags I had ignored because I couldn't bring myself to believe she would do this to me. To us. As much as I wanted to confront her right away, I knew I needed more than a vague suspicion and a few cryptic texts. Megan was clever, and if I accused her without concrete proof, she'd find a way to twist the narrative, make me doubt myself. I needed something undeniable, something that would expose the truth in a way she couldn't wriggle out of. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. In fact, the thought of what I was about to do made my skin crawl. But I had to know. I had to see it with my own eyes. Megan's car was parked in the driveway when I got home that evening, her usual spot right next to mine. I glanced at it, the silver Honda that had been her pride and joy when we first bought it. Now, it was just another part of the facade she had built around her betrayal. I resisted the urge to put my fist through the windshield. Instead, I walked into the house, my mind racing with the plan I'd been piecing together all day. Megan was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. It was one of those rare moments where everything seemed normal. The smell of sautéing onions filled the air, and the boys were upstairs, likely engrossed in their video games. For a fleeting moment, I considered letting it all go, pretending I hadn't seen those texts, hadn't uncovered the truth. But the anger bubbling beneath the surface wouldn't allow it. "Hey, babe," Megan greeted me with a smile, her eyes lighting up as I walked in. "You're home early." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Just wrapped things up a little quicker today." She turned back to the stove, stirring the pot as if everything was just as it should be, as if she wasn't hiding a massive secret. I watched her, trying to see her the way I had before, but all I could think about was the other man. Richard, my boss, the man she had been sneaking around with behind my back. "Smells good," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My hands were trembling, so I shoved them into my pockets, clenching them into fists. "I thought I'd make your favorite tonight," she said, glancing over her shoulder with that familiar smile. "It's been a while since we had a nice dinner together." My stomach twisted. How long had it been since we'd had anything together? How many times had she smiled at me like that, all the while knowing she'd been with him? I had to bite down on the inside of my cheek to keep from snapping. "Sounds great," I managed, stepping closer and wrapping my arms around her waist from behind. She leaned into me, and for a moment, I almost believed that things could go back to the way they were. But then, I remembered what I had to do. "I was thinking," I began, keeping my tone casual. Maybe we could do something different this weekend. Take the boys out, maybe go to the lake. What do you think? She hesitated, and I could feel her body tense slightly in my arms. The lake, she repeated, her voice a little too light. I don't know, Eric. I thought I might spend some time with the girls. Just a little break. Another girls' night? I asked, letting a hint of curiosity slip into my voice. You've been doing that a lot lately. She shrugged, slipping out of my embrace to turn off the stove. We just have a lot of catching up to do. That's all. You know how it is. I nodded, watching her closely as she busied herself with the dinner preparations. She was lying. I was sure of it. There was no girls' night planned. It was just another excuse to meet Richard. I had no proof yet, but I could feel it in my bones. My mind raced, searching for a way to catch her in the act. Then it hit me. The GPS tracker. A while back, I'd bought a small, discreet GPS tracker for work, thinking it might come in handy for keeping track of inventory or the kids if they ever got into trouble. I'd forgotten all about it until now. I could use it to track Megan's car, see exactly where she went when she claimed to be with her friends. It felt wrong, sneaky, but then again, so was cheating on your husband. And if I was right, if she was really meeting Richard, then I needed to know for sure. Maybe I'll come with you, I said suddenly, testing her reaction. I could use a break too. She stiffened, her back still turned to me. I don't think that's a good idea, Eric. It's just us girls, you know. You'd be bored. I wouldn't mind, I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. We could have some fun together. Megan turned to face me, her expression carefully controlled. Maybe next time, okay? This weekend's already planned. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say anything else. She was hiding something, that much was clear, but I wasn't going to push it. Not yet. Not until I had the tracker in place. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. We had dinner, and I forced myself to play along, laughing at her jokes, engaging in small talk, all the while planning my next move. By the time we went to bed, I had everything figured out. I would wait until she was asleep, then slip out to her car and attach the tracker. It was a small device, no bigger than a matchbox, and I could easily hide it under the chassis where she wouldn't notice. It was around midnight when I finally heard her breathing slow, her body relaxing into sleep. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to wake her, and grabbed the tracker from my office drawer. My hands were trembling as I made my way downstairs and out the front door. The night was cool, the streetlights casting long shadows across the driveway. I approached Megan's car, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Not that anyone would care. This was a quiet neighborhood, and everyone was probably fast asleep by now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I was doing was wrong, that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But then I thought of Richard, of the way Megan had been acting, and my resolve hardened. I crouched down beside the car, attaching the tracker to the underside of the chassis. It clicked into place, invisible unless you knew where to look. When I finished, I stood up and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This was it. The next time she went out, I would know exactly where she was going. And if she was meeting Richard, there would be no denying it. The following days were a test of my patience. I had to act normal, keep up the facade while I waited for Megan's next girls' night. She didn't mention anything about the weekend plans again, and I didn't push her. I needed her to think everything was fine, that I wasn't suspicious. Finally, on Friday evening, she dropped the bombshell I had been waiting for. I'm heading out for a bit, she said casually as she gathered her things. I'll probably be back late, so don't wait up. Another girls' night? I asked, pretending to be indifferent. Yeah, just some catching up, she replied, slipping on her coat. You know how it is. I nodded, forcing a smile. Have fun. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and headed out the door, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in my chest. I waited until I heard her car start, the headlights sweeping across the living room window as she backed out of the driveway. As soon as she was gone, I rushed to my laptop and opened the tracking app. The little red dot representing Megan's car blinked to life on the screen, moving steadily down the street. I watched it for a moment, the reality of what I was about to do sinking in. This was it. There would be no turning back after tonight. I grabbed my keys and headed out to my own car, barely able to keep my hands steady. I felt like I was in a movie, a spy thriller where the hero had to track down the villain. But this was no movie. This was my life, and the villain was the woman I had loved for almost 20 years. I kept my distance, following the tracker as it led me through the city. At first, it seemed like she was just heading downtown, maybe to meet her friends as she had claimed. But then, the dot took a sudden turn, veering off the main road and into a more secluded area. My heart pounded harder as I recognized the street, an industrial area on the outskirts of town, lined with warehouses and empty lots. There was nothing here, no bars, no restaurants, no reason for Megan to be here unless she was meeting him. The dot finally stopped, and I slowed my car, pulling into a side street where I could keep an eye on her location without being seen. My hands were sweating, and my mouth was dry as I watched the screen, waiting to see what she would do next. A few minutes later, I saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. Another car pulled up alongside Megan's, and I felt my stomach drop as I recognized it. Richard's black BMW. There was no mistaking it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as I watched the two cars sit there side by side, their occupants hidden in the shadows. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, each one worse than the last. I imagined them laughing together, kissing, doing God knows what else in the darkness of their cars. My world was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. After what felt like an eternity, Megan's car door opened, and she stepped out. I could see her silhouette in the dim light, walking over to Richard's car. He got out too, and for a moment they just stood there, facing each other. Then, without warning, they were in each other's arms, their bodies pressed together in a way that left no room for doubt. I watched as they kissed, long and deep, like lovers who couldn't bear to be apart. That was all I could take. My vision blurred with rage and betrayal as I shoved the car door open and stormed toward them. The sound of my footsteps must have alerted them because they broke apart, turning to face me with wide eyes. "Eric?" Megan's voice was a mixture of shock and fear as she took a step back. "What are you doing here?" "What the hell do you think I'm doing here?" I roared, my voice echoing in the empty lot. "You lying, cheating bitch!" Richard raised his hands, trying to placate me, but I was beyond reasoning. All I could see was red. "Eric, calm down. Let's talk about this." "Talk?" I spat, advancing on them. "You want to talk after what you've done? After you fucked my wife behind my back?" Megan flinched at the harshness of my words, but I didn't care. She deserved worse. They both did. "Eric, please," Megan pleaded, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think. It was just..." "Just what?" I cut her off, my fists clenched at my sides. "Just sex? Just a bit of fun? How long has this been going on, Megan? How long have you been lying to me?" She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. She just stood there, looking small and pathetic in the face of my fury. "Answer me!" I shouted, my voice cracking with the intensity of my emotions. "Months," she finally whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's been going on for months." Her confession hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of me. Months. Months of lies, of betrayal. Months where she had been pretending to be the loving wife while sneaking around with my boss. My head spun, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Richard stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "Eric, let's not make this worse than it already is. We can work this out." I turned on him, my anger flaring up again. "Work this out? Are you fucking serious? You think you can just smooth this over like a business deal? You're nothing but a goddamn piece of shit, Richard." Before I knew what I was doing, I lunged at him, my fists swinging wildly. All the rage, all the pain that had been building up inside me exploded in that moment, and I wanted to hurt him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused me. Richard wasn't expecting it, and I managed to land a punch squarely on his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Megan screamed, rushing forward to pull me away, but I shoved her aside, my focus entirely on Richard. He recovered quickly, squaring up to defend himself, but I was relentless. My fists flew, fueled by the betrayal that had shattered my life. I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was making him pay. Finally, Richard managed to land a hit, catching me in the ribs and knocking the wind out of me. I doubled over, gasping for breath, but I wasn't finished yet. I lunged at him again, ready to go another round, but Megan threw herself between us, her hands pressing against my chest. "Eric, stop! Please, stop!" she sobbed, her face streaked with tears. "This isn't going to help anything." I froze, staring down at her as she pleaded with me, her voice raw with desperation. For a moment, the red haze in my mind cleared, and I saw her for what she was, a broken woman, trapped in a situation she couldn't control. But then I remembered why we were here, remembered the way she had kissed Richard, and the anger came flooding back. "Get out of my way, Megan," I growled, trying to push her aside. "No!" she cried, holding her ground. "Please, Eric, just stop. We can talk about this. We can fix this." "Fix this?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You think there's anything left to fix? You've destroyed everything, Megan. There's no going back." She crumpled at my words, her sobs tearing through the night. Richard was still on the ground, nursing his bruised jaw, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All I could do was stare at the wreckage of my life, wondering how the hell I was going to pick up the pieces. Finally, I turned and walked away, leaving them both behind. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to escape the pain that was threatening to consume me. As I drove aimlessly through the night, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Megan had cheated on me. My wife, the mother of my children, had been fucking my boss for months. And now, my life as I knew it was over. There was no coming back from this. No way to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. All that was left was the cold, hard truth. I had been betrayed by the one person I had trusted the most. The next morning, I awoke with a start, my body aching from the fight with Richard. The events of the previous night came crashing back with brutal clarity, and for a moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it had all been a nightmare. But the dull throbbing in my ribs and the rawness in my throat told me otherwise. It had been real, every awful second of it. I was alone in a cheap motel room on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the comfort of my own home. After leaving the scene with Megan and Richard, I had driven aimlessly for hours, trying to outrun the pain, the betrayal, but it had clung to me like a shadow. Eventually, exhaustion had forced me to pull into the nearest motel, where I'd collapsed into bed, hoping for oblivion. But there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. Megan's affair had ripped a hole in my life, leaving me adrift in a sea of anger and despair. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't avoid her forever. We had kids, a house, a life that had to be dealt with, no matter how much I wanted to burn it all to the ground. I dragged myself out of bed, wincing as the movement sent a sharp pain through my side. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was a grim reminder of the night before. My knuckles were bruised and swollen, a testament to the punches I'd thrown at Richard, and there was a darkening bruise on my jaw where he had managed to hit me back. I splashed some cold water on my face, trying to wash away the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. What now? I thought bitterly. What the hell do I do now? There was no easy answer. Part of me wanted to pack up my things, take the kids, and leave Megan to rot in the mess she had created. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Divorce was an option. But the thought of tearing my family apart, of making Tyler and Jason suffer because of Megan's betrayal, made me sick to my stomach. And yet, how could I ever look at her again, knowing what she had done? How could I sleep in the same bed, share the same space, pretend that everything was okay when the very foundation of our marriage had been shattered? My phone buzzed on the nightstand, dragging me out of my thoughts. I hesitated before picking it up, half expecting to see a message from Megan, but it wasn't her. It was a text from Tyler. "Hey, Dad. Where are you? Mom said you had to work late, but you didn't come home." The innocence of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. He didn't know, of course. How could he? To him, everything was still as it should be. His parents still the solid, unbreakable force that had always been there. I quickly typed out a response, my hands shaking. "I'm fine, buddy. Just had to take care of something. I'll be home soon." But as I hit send, I knew that soon was a relative term. I wasn't ready to face Megan yet. Wasn't ready to confront the mess that awaited me at home. But I also knew that I couldn't hide out in a motel forever. The longer I stayed away, the more questions Tyler and Jason would have, and I didn't want to put them through that. With a heavy heart, I gathered my things and checked out of the motel. The drive home was torture, each passing mile bringing me closer to the inevitable confrontation with Megan. My mind raced with 1,000 scenarios, each one more painful than the last. What would she say? Would she try to defend herself? Would she lie, try to spin some story to explain away what I'd seen? By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Megan's car was there, parked neatly beside mine, just as it always was. But now, it looked different, like a stranger's car, something that didn't belong in my life anymore. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. There was no turning back now. I had to face this, had to confront the woman who had torn my world apart. The house was eerily quiet as I stepped inside, the usual sounds of life absent. Tyler and Jason were at school, and for a moment, I was grateful that I wouldn't have to face them just yet. I wasn't ready to explain why their father looked like he'd gone 10 rounds in a boxing match, or why their mother might not be around much longer. Megan was in the living room, sitting on the couch with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "Eric," she began, her voice trembling. Save it," I snapped, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses, Megan." She flinched at the venom in my voice, but I didn't care. She deserved every bit of it and more. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I never meant for this to happen." "Never meant for this to happen," I repeated, my voice rising with anger. "You've been fucking my boss for months, Megan. How the hell do you never mean for something like that to happen?" She broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I'm sorry, Eric. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I was lonely, and Richard was there, and it just happened." "Lonely?" I scoffed, shaking my head in disbelief. "You were lonely, so you decided to screw my boss. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed our family, Megan. You've destroyed everything." "I know," she cried, looking up at me with pleading eyes. "I know I've hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But please, Eric, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. Please, just give me a chance to make it right." "Make it right?" I laughed bitterly. "There's no making this right, Megan. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. And you didn't just hurt me. You hurt Tyler. You hurt Jason. How am I supposed to explain to them that their mother is a lying, cheating whore?" She recoiled as if I had slapped her, her sobs growing louder. "Please, Eric, don't say that. I know I've made a terrible mistake, but I love you. I love our family. I'll do anything to fix this. Anything." "Anything?" I repeated, my voice cold. "It's too late for that, Megan. You should have thought about that before you spread your legs for Richard." The words were cruel, harsher than I'd ever spoken to her before, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the pain, the betrayal that was tearing me apart. "I'm begging you, Eric," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her tears. "Please don't leave me. Please don't take the boys away from me. I can't lose you. I can't lose our family." I stared down at her, this woman who had been my wife, my partner, my everything, and now all I could see was the person who had destroyed everything we had built together. "I don't know what I'm going to do," I said finally, my voice hollow. "But I can't stay here, Megan. I can't stay in this house with you, pretending that everything is okay. I need time to think, to figure out what the hell I'm going to do." She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. "But please, Eric, don't make any decisions yet. Just give us a chance." "A chance?" I shook my head, disbelief mixing with anger. "You had your chance, Megan, and you threw it away." With that, I turned and walked out of the living room, leaving her sobbing on the couch. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't be there, couldn't be near her. Not after everything that had happened. The house felt suffocating. Each room filled with memories that now felt tainted, twisted by the knowledge of what she had done. I grabbed my keys and headed back out to my car, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. As I sat in the driver's seat, I pounded the steering wheel in frustration, anger boiling over inside me. How could she do this to me? How could she destroy everything we had built, everything we had worked so hard to create? And now she expected me to just forgive her, to pretend that everything could go back to the way it was? No, there was no going back. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who had lied to me, betrayed me in the worst possible way. I had to get out of there. I had to get away from the house, from Megan, from the life that had been torn apart. But where could I go? What was I supposed to do now? The rage that had consumed me during the confrontation with Megan began to mutate into something colder, more calculated, as I drove aimlessly through the city. I replayed her tearful pleas in my mind, each one more pathetic and infuriating than the last. She had ruined our lives, shattered everything we had built, and now she wanted me to give her another chance. No, that was too easy. She needed to understand the depth of the pain she had caused, and I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of it. Revenge was a word I had never associated with myself. I had always been a rational man, someone who believed in fairness, in taking the high road. But that part of me had been obliterated the moment I saw Megan in Richard's arms. Now, all I could think about was how to make her suffer, how to make her feel the same agony that was eating me alive. By the time I found myself parked outside a 24-hour convenience store, I had the beginnings of a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't enough to just leave her. That would be too clean, too simple. Megan needed to understand what it felt like to be betrayed, to have everything she cared about ripped away from her. She needed to pay for what she had done, and I was going to make sure she did. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Jim, an old friend from college who had gone down a darker path after graduation. We had lost touch over the years, but I knew he was still around, still connected to the kind of people who could get things done quietly. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the call button. But then the memory of Megan's betrayal surged back, fueling my resolve. I pressed the button and brought the phone to my ear. Jim picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Who the hell is this?" "It's Eric," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Eric?" He sounded surprised, then wary. "What's up, man? It's been a long time." "I need a favor," I said, cutting to the chase. "Something that stays off the books, if you know what I mean." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that requires discretion," I replied, glancing around the parking lot to make sure I was alone. "I need someone who can dig up dirt on a person, someone who can help me make their life a living hell." Another pause, longer this time. "You sure you want to go down this road, Eric? This isn't like you." I clenched my teeth, the anger flaring up again. "I'm sure. Can you help me or not?" Jim sighed, the sound heavy with reluctance. "Yeah, I can help, but you need to be damn sure about this. Once we start, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," I said, my voice firm. "Let's meet tomorrow. I'll fill you in on the details." We arranged a time and place to meet, and I hung up, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction settle over me. This was the first step in making Megan pay for what she had done. But there was more to the plan, something that would hit her where it hurt the most. I drove back to the house, my mind spinning with possibilities. Megan had always been proud of her role as a mother, always made a point of being the perfect wife and mother in front of everyone. She loved to play the part, loved the admiration and respect it brought her from our friends and neighbors. But now, I was going to tear that facade apart. I was going to strip her of everything she held dear, make her the object of scorn and pity, just like she had made me. The house was dark when I returned, the only light coming from the living room where Megan had left a lamp on. I slipped inside quietly, not wanting to alert her to my presence. The last thing I wanted was another confrontation. Not yet, anyway. I went straight to my office and sat down at the computer, my mind racing. I knew Megan had taken pictures, videos of our life together, photos of the kids, of our vacations, of everything we had built. But there was something else she had. A private collection of more intimate moments between us. She had always insisted on keeping them, saying they were just for us, something to look back on when we were old and gray. Well, Now they were going to serve a different purpose. I opened her email account, the password something I had memorized long ago. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, a folder filled with photos and videos that had been shared only between us. Megan had kept them all, some dating back years. My stomach churned as I opened the first file, a video of us together in bed, laughing, touching. It had been one of the few times in recent years when we had connected, when I had believed that we were still strong, still unbreakable. I copied everything to a flash drive, my hands trembling as I worked. This was it, the evidence I needed to destroy her. I would leak these photos and videos, anonymously, of course, to the right people. The scandal would spread like wildfire, turning her into a pariah, a joke. She would be humiliated, stripped of her dignity, just as she had stripped me of mine. But that wasn't all. I would make sure that everyone knew the truth about her affair with Richard. I would spread the word through our social circles, tell her friends, her family, everyone who thought she was so perfect. I would make sure they all knew what kind of woman she really was. A cheating, lying bitch who had destroyed her family for a fling with her husband's boss. Once I had everything I needed, I tucked the flash drive into my pocket and sat back, my heart pounding. It felt good, knowing that I had the power to ruin her, to make her pay for what she had done. But it also felt wrong. A nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me that this wasn't who I was, that I was sinking to her level. I silenced the voice, shoving it deep down where I couldn't hear it. Megan had made her choice, and now she was going to live with the consequences. The next day I met Jim at a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people went to disappear. He looked older, rougher than the last time I had seen him, his hair graying at the temples, and his face lined with wear. But his eyes were sharp, assessing me as I sat down across from him. "So, what's the story?" he asked, taking a sip of his beer. I told him everything, the affair, the lies, the betrayal. I didn't hold back, laying it all out in stark detail. By the time I finished, Jim was nodding slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You want to ruin her," he said, more a statement than a question. "I want to destroy her," I corrected, my voice cold. Jim leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I can dig up whatever dirt you need, but this isn't going to be easy, Eric. And it's not going to be cheap." "I don't care," I replied, pulling out a thick envelope of cash from my pocket and sliding it across the table. "Whatever it takes." Jim took the envelope, flipping through the bills with a practiced hand. "You're serious about this?" "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," I said, meeting his gaze. "I want her to lose everything, Jim. I want her to suffer." He nodded, slipping the envelope into his jacket. "Consider it done. I'll start digging, see what I can find. Give me a few days." "Make sure it's thorough," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I want every dirty little secret, every skeleton in her closet." Jim nodded again, finishing his beer and standing up. "You got it. I'll be in touch." I watched him go, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over me. This was the first step in making Megan pay, in taking back control of my life. But as I sat there, staring at the empty glass in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a dark place, one that I might not be able to come back from. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the plan with a single-minded focus. I leaked the photos and videos, careful to cover my tracks, making sure they couldn't be traced back to me. I spread the word about her affair with Richard, letting it slip to just the right people, knowing it would spread like wildfire. The gossip, the whispers, they would tear her reputation apart, make her a laughingstock. And then, there were the little things. I canceled her credit cards, moved money out of our joint account into one she couldn't access. I changed the passwords to all our online accounts, cutting her off from everything. I knew it wouldn't be long before she realized what I was doing, but by then, it would be too late. The first sign that my plan was working came 2 days later, when Megan called me in a panic, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "Eric, my cards aren't working!" she cried, her words tumbling over each other. "And the bank says our account is empty! What's going on?" I smiled coldly, leaning back in my chair. "I thought you might want to learn what it's like to be on your own, Megan, to fend for yourself, since you seem so good at doing things behind my back." "What? Eric, you can't do this!" she shrieked, her voice filled with desperation. "I need that money! I need those accounts! Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to fuck my boss, I replied icily. You made your bed, Megan. Now you get to lie in it. She was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out what to say, how to manipulate the situation. You're hurting the kids, Eric, she said finally, her voice trembling. They need that money too. We can't. The kids will be fine, I cut her off, my voice hard. But you? You're on your own now. You can figure out how to survive without my help. I hung up before she could respond, a grim sense of satisfaction washing over me. She had wanted to destroy our family, to tear us apart, and now she was going to feel the consequences of her actions. I didn't care about her tears, her pleas. She deserved everything that was coming to her. But even as I reveled in the success of my revenge, a part of me couldn't help but feel a hollow emptiness creeping in. Each time I took another step to ruin her, I felt a piece of myself slipping away, as if I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. But I pushed those thoughts aside, burying them deep. This was about justice. This was about making her pay. As the days went on, I could see the effects of my actions taking hold. Megan grew more desperate, more frantic with each passing day. She called me repeatedly, begging for forgiveness, pleading for me to stop, but I ignored her calls, letting them go to voicemail, each message more desperate than the last. Then, one evening, I came home to find her waiting for me, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and for a moment I almost felt a pang of pity. But then I remembered why we were here, why she was suffering, and the pity evaporated. Eric, please, she begged, her voice breaking. Please, can we talk? Can we try to fix this? Fix this? I repeated, my voice dripping with disdain. You think there's anything left to fix, Megan? You destroyed everything, and now you're getting exactly what you deserve. She reached out to touch my arm, but I jerked away, the sight of her touch repulsive. Please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I love you, Eric. I'm sorry. I made a mistake, but I love you. Please don't do this. I stared at her, this woman who had been my wife, who had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I realized with a cold clarity that I felt nothing for her anymore. No love, no affection, only contempt. You don't love me, I said coldly, stepping past her. You never did. You love yourself, Megan. You love your image, your perfect little life. But that's gone now, and you have no one to blame but yourself. She crumpled to the floor, sobbing, but I didn't look back. I walked away, leaving her there, broken and alone. And as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, a sense of finality settled over me. The woman I had loved, the life I had built, it was all gone, and there was no going back. I had gotten my revenge. I had destroyed her, just as she had destroyed me. But as I stood there in the darkness of our bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was no longer mine, I couldn't help but wonder if I had destroyed myself as well. After the devastation I had unleashed on Megan, I should have felt some sense of satisfaction, some closure. But as the days passed, all I felt was an empty hollowness. The revenge I had taken on her had been brutal and effective, but it hadn't brought me the peace I thought it would. Instead, it left me more restless, more consumed by the burning need to make Richard pay as well. After all, he was just as guilty, if not more so, than Megan. Richard had not only betrayed me as a friend, but had also crossed a professional line by having an affair with his subordinate's wife. The smug bastard thought he could get away with it, that his position and power made him untouchable. But I was determined to prove him wrong. Unlike Megan, Richard had carefully maintained his public image, a successful, well-respected businessman with a perfect family. He had always been the golden boy at work, admired and envied by everyone in the office. But I knew his secrets now, and I was going to tear down the carefully constructed facade he had built around himself. My first step was to gather more information. I needed to know everything about Richard, his habits, his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities. And for that, I turned to Jim. He had delivered on the dirt about Megan, and I knew he could help me bring Richard to his knees. We met again, this time in a different location, an upscale restaurant that Richard frequented, a place where he liked to conduct business over expensive meals. I chose it deliberately, a reminder of the life Richard valued so much. the life I was about to rip apart. Jim was already there when I arrived, sipping a glass of whiskey at the bar. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this, Eric?" he asked as I sat down beside him. "Taking down a guy like Richard, it's a big move. You sure you're ready for what comes next?" I met his gaze, my voice steady. "I'm sure. He's going to pay for what he did." Jim nodded, signaling the bartender for another drink. "All right. I've already started digging. Richard's got a lot of skeletons in his closet, but he's good at keeping them hidden. It's going to take some time to get everything we need, but I'll find it." "I don't care how long it takes," I replied, my tone cold. "Just make sure it's thorough. I want to destroy him." Jim studied me for a moment, then nodded again. "You got it. I'll start with his finances. Guys like him always have something shady going on. Once I find a crack, I'll widen it until the whole thing comes crashing down." We discussed the plan in detail, going over the steps we would take to dismantle Richard's life piece by piece. It was a meticulous, methodical process, and I found a grim satisfaction in it. This was more than just revenge. It was justice. Richard had crossed a line, and now he was going to suffer the consequences. Over the next few weeks, Jim fed me a steady stream of information about Richard. The man was as dirty as they came: hidden bank accounts, under-the-table deals, affairs with other women, even allegations of sexual harassment that had been quietly settled out of court. He had built his empire on lies and deceit, and now it was all going to come crashing down. I started by leaking the information to the right people: journalists, competitors, anyone who would jump at the chance to take Richard down. It didn't take long for the first article to appear, a scathing expose on his shady business practices, complete with documents that Jim had procured. The fallout was immediate. Investors started pulling out, clients began canceling contracts, and the company's stock plummeted. Richard was suddenly fighting to keep his business afloat, his perfect life unraveling before his eyes. But that was just the beginning. Next, I turned my attention to his personal life. I leaked the details of his affairs to his wife, sending her an anonymous package filled with photos, texts, and emails that left no room for doubt. It wasn't just about Megan. I included evidence of every other woman he had been with, a comprehensive record of his infidelities. I knew the package had arrived when I saw Richard storm out of the office one afternoon, his face twisted in rage. He didn't return for the rest of the day, and the rumors started swirling almost immediately. People whispered about the fight he had with his wife, how she had kicked him out of the house, how she was filing for divorce. It was exactly what I had planned: a complete destruction of his personal life, leaving him with nothing. But I wasn't done yet. The next phase of my plan was to hit him where it hurt the most: his reputation. Richard had always prided himself on his image, his standing in the community. He was a member of several prestigious clubs, a regular at charity events, a man who was seen as a pillar of society. But all of that was about to change. Jim had uncovered evidence of bribery and corruption, deals that Richard had made to secure contracts and suppress competition. It was the kind of thing that would destroy his reputation if it ever came to light. And I made sure it did. I leaked the documents to a rival company, one that had been chomping at the bit to take Richard down. They wasted no time in using the information to launch a full-scale investigation, one that quickly made its way to the authorities. The news broke like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the business world. Richard was implicated in a massive corruption scandal. His name splashed across headlines, his face plastered on every news channel. The investigation was swift and brutal, uncovering more dirt than even I had anticipated. It wasn't long before the authorities came knocking, and Richard was arrested, charged with multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and embezzlement. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, a grim satisfaction settling over me as Richard's life fell apart. The company he had worked so hard to build was in ruins. His wife had left him, his reputation was in tatters, and now he was facing the very real possibility of prison time. It was everything I had wanted, everything I had planned. But as I stood there, watching the news coverage of Richard's downfall, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered in the pit of my stomach. I had destroyed him, just as I had destroyed Megan, but the satisfaction I had expected was fleeting, hollow. The phone on my desk buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Jim. "It's done," he said when I answered. "Richard's finished. He won't be able to bounce back from this." "I know. I replied, my voice flat. You did good work, Jim. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You don't sound too happy about it. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I thought it would feel different, you know. I thought it would make everything better. And does it? No, I admitted. It doesn't. Jim was silent for a moment, then spoke again, his voice softer this time. Revenge doesn't fix anything, Eric. It just leaves you with more broken pieces. I didn't respond, the truth of his words hitting me harder than I expected. I had been so consumed with making them pay, with destroying the people who had hurt me, that I hadn't stopped to think about what it would mean for me. And now that it was over, I realized that I was left with nothing but the wreckage of my own life. Take care of yourself, man, Jim said quietly. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. I thanked him and hung up, the silence of my office closing in around me. The vengeance that had driven me for so long was gone, leaving behind a void that I didn't know how to fill. Megan was ruined, Richard was destroyed, and yet I felt no better than I had before. If anything, I felt worse. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions churning inside me. I had lost everything. My wife, my family, my sense of self, all in the pursuit of revenge. And now that I had it, I was left wondering if it had been worth it. But there was no turning back. What was done was done. I had burned my bridges, severed ties that could never be mended. I was alone, with nothing but the ashes of a life that had once been mine. In the days that followed, the fallout from Richard's scandal continued to spread. His company collapsed, and he was left to face the legal consequences of his actions alone. His friends and colleagues abandoned him, distancing themselves from the man who had once been at the top of the world. It was everything I had wanted, everything I had worked so hard to achieve. And yet, it brought me no peace. Megan tried to contact me several times, leaving voicemails and sending messages, but I ignored them all. I couldn't bring myself to face her, to deal with the remnants of our broken marriage. I had already made her suffer, already destroyed her life, and there was nothing left to say. One evening, I received a final message from her, the words simple and filled with despair. I'm sorry for everything, Eric. I'll always love you. I stared at the message for a long time, the words blurring in front of my eyes. It was too late for apologies, too late for love. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I deleted the message and turned off my phone, the weight of everything I had done pressing down on me. In the end, revenge had brought me nothing but emptiness. I had destroyed the lives of the people who had wronged me, but in doing so, I had destroyed myself as well. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that could never be whole again. The weeks that followed Richard's downfall and Megan's devastation were some of the darkest of my life. The high I had felt from executing my revenge had long since faded, replaced by a hollow numbness that left me feeling adrift. The satisfaction I had craved never came. Instead, I was haunted by the memories of the life I had destroyed, not just theirs, but my own as well. I had become a ghost in my own home, a shadow of the man I once was. Tyler and Jason knew something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to them about it. How could I explain what I had done, what their mother had done, without destroying their innocent view of the world? I couldn't look them in the eyes without feeling like a failure. A father who had let them down, a husband who had lost everything. Megan had stopped trying to reach out, her last message left unanswered. But even though I had cut off all contact, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the wreckage I had left behind. I tried to drown out the thoughts with work, with alcohol, with anything that would numb the pain. But nothing worked. The emptiness inside me only grew, gnawing away at my soul. I was in the middle of another sleepless night, staring blankly at the television, when I heard a soft knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat, a part of me knowing who it was before I even got up to answer. I hadn't seen Megan since that last confrontation, hadn't even spoken to her, but I knew she would come eventually. The knocking continued, hesitant, almost as if she was afraid to disturb me. I stood in the hallway for a moment, debating whether to ignore it. to let her think I wasn't home. But something compelled me to open the door, to face the woman who had once meant everything to me. Megan stood on the porch, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She looked smaller, frailer than I remembered, as if the weight of everything had crushed her. She was holding a small suitcase in one hand, and the sight of it made my heart sink. She was leaving. "Eric," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, the instinct to slam the door in her face warring with something deeper, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Finally, I stepped aside, letting her in. She entered the house cautiously, as if she was afraid it might swallow her whole. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said, all the pain we had caused each other. She set the suitcase down by the door, her hands shaking as she did. For a moment she just stood there, staring at the floor, before finally looking up at me. The pain in her eyes was unmistakable, and it twisted something inside me, something I had thought was long dead. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was time." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. I had wanted this, hadn't I? I had wanted her gone, out of my life, away from the wreckage she had caused. But now that it was happening, I felt nothing but a cold emptiness. "I didn't want to go without seeing you one last time," she continued, her voice breaking. I know you hate me and I deserve that, but I needed to say goodbye." "Goodbye?" The word felt foreign on my tongue, as if it didn't belong between us. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while. She offered to help me get back on my feet." I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. This was it, the end, the final chapter in the story of us. "What about the boys?" I asked, my voice rough. "I'll come back for them," she said quickly, almost desperately. "I would never leave them. But I need some time, Eric. Time to figure out how to live without you." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Why did you do it, Megan?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, the words raw and painful. She flinched, as if the question had physically hurt her. "I don't know," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I was stupid, selfish. I thought I needed something more, something different. I didn't realize what I was losing until it was too late." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, the honesty in them cutting through the anger and resentment I had been holding on to. I wanted to lash out, to throw her mistakes back in her face, but all I could feel was a deep, aching sorrow. "I loved you, Megan," I said, my voice shaking. "I gave you everything. How could you throw it all away?" She broke down, her sobs filling the empty house. "I don't know, Eric. I don't know. If I could take it all back, I would. I swear I would." We stood there in silence, the weight of everything between us too much to bear. I had spent so much time hating her, so much time plotting my revenge, that I had forgotten what it felt like to love her, to care about her. And now, as she stood before me, broken and defeated, I couldn't find it in myself to hate her anymore. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I'm so sorry." The apology should have made a difference, should have given me some sense of closure, but it didn't. It only made the emptiness inside me grow, the realization that nothing could ever undo what had been done. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said, my voice raw. "But I can't keep hating you either. It's killing me, Megan." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate hope. Does that mean there's a chance? A chance we could—" "No," I said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "There's no going back. Too much has happened. Too much has been destroyed." Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might collapse right there on the floor. But she straightened up, wiping the tears from her eyes. "I understand," she whispered. I'll go now." I watched as she picked up her suitcase, the weight of it almost too much for her to bear. Every instinct in me screamed to let her go, to close the door and never look back. But there was a part of me, a part that had loved her for nearly 2 decades, that couldn't let her leave like this. "Megan!" I called out, my voice catching in my throat. She turned, her eyes wide with surprise. I took a step forward, struggling to find the words. I don't want this to end with us hating each other." She nodded, her lip trembling. "I don't want that either." We stood there, staring at each other, two broken people trying to make sense of the pieces of their shattered lives. I didn't know what to say, what to do, but I knew I couldn't let her leave without acknowledging the love we had once shared. "I'm sorry too," I finally said, my voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Her eyes filled with fresh tears, but she managed a small, sad smile. "I know." We stood there for a moment longer, the air between us heavy with all the things left unsaid. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the house that had once been our home. I stood there, staring at the closed door, my mind numb. This was what I had wanted. An end, a final break from the woman who had betrayed me. But as the silence settled around me, I realized that I felt no relief, no closure, only a deep, aching emptiness that consumed everything in its path. I spent the rest of the night pacing the empty house, the memories of Megan haunting me at every turn. Every room, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall was a reminder of the life we had shared, the life that was now gone. By the time the sun began to rise, I felt like a shell of the man I once was, drained of everything that had once defined me. The revenge I had taken on Megan and Richard had brought me nothing but more pain, more emptiness. And now, I was alone, with nothing but the memories of what I had lost. Later that day, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee cup in front of me, the steam rising slowly into the air. I thought about Tyler and Jason, about how I would tell them that their mother was gone, that our family was broken. I thought about the future, about what life would look like now that everything had changed. But most of all, I thought about Megan, about the love we had once shared, the life we had built together. I thought about the good times, the laughter, the moments when we had been happy. And I realized with a sharp pang of regret that I had lost more than just a wife. I had lost a part of myself, a part that I might never get back. The sound of the doorbell broke through my thoughts, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment I thought it might be Megan, that she had come back, that she couldn't bear to leave things as they were. But when I opened the door, it wasn't her. It was Richard. He looked as bad as I felt, disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his face unshaven. The once confident man who had dominated every room he walked into was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, shame, and desperation. "Eric," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk." I stared at him, the memories of what he had done, of what I had done to him, flooding back. And in that moment, I knew that this was it, the final confrontation, the last conversation that would bring an end to everything. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him in. My voice was calm, almost detached, as if I was watching the scene unfold from a distance. Richard hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, his movements stiff and hesitant. I led him to the living room, where we both sat down on opposite ends of the couch, the silence between us heavy with tension. "What do you want, Richard?" I asked, my tone cold and controlled. He looked down at his hands, as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, filled with a desperation that surprised me. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, his eyes still focused on the floor. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I needed you to hear it." I watched him, my emotions a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to never see his face again. But another part of me, a part that was tired of the anger, the hatred, wanted to hear him out. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" He sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Because I'm a selfish bastard," he admitted. "I wanted her, and I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about you, or your family, or what it would do to either of us. I just wanted her." The honesty in his words caught me off guard. For so long, I had built Richard up in my mind as the villain, the man who had ruined my life. But now, as he sat there, broken and remorseful, I saw him for what he truly was, a flawed, desperate man who had made a terrible mistake. "I've lost everything," he continued, his voice cracking. "My wife, my kids, my career. It's all gone. And it's my fault. I did this to myself. But you helped destroy me, Eric. You took everything from me." His words hit me like a sledgehammer, the weight of what I had done crashing down on me. I had wanted to destroy him, to make him suffer the way I had suffered. And I had succeeded. But in doing so, I had become something I never thought I would be: vindictive, cruel, and merciless. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Do you regret what you did to her? To me?" Richard looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. "Every day," he whispered. "Every goddamn day." The anger that had fueled me for so long began to drain away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. I had wanted to destroy Richard, to make him pay for what he had done. But now, as I looked at the broken man in front of me, I realized that I had only destroyed myself. "I regret what I did to you too," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I wanted revenge, and I got it. But it didn't fix anything. It just made everything worse." Richard nodded, a sad understanding in his eyes. Revenge never does. We sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging over us. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. We had both lost, both destroyed by our own actions, our own choices. Finally, Richard stood up, his movements slow and weary. "I'm leaving town," he said quietly. "I need to start over, away from all of this. I wanted to say goodbye." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. I watched as he walked to the door, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. He paused at the threshold, turning back to face me one last time. "I'm sorry, Eric," he said, his voice filled with a deep, abiding regret. "For everything." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where Richard had stood, my mind racing. This was it, the end of everything. The final conversation that would bring closure, that would put an end to the pain and suffering we had all caused each other. But as the silence settled around me, I realized that there was no closure, no peace to be found. The damage had been done, the lives destroyed. And now, all that was left was to pick up the pieces and move forward, somehow, some way. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house that had once been my home. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there, surrounded by the ghosts of what had been. I needed to find a way to heal, to move on from the wreckage of my life. As I drove away, leaving behind the memories of Megan, of Richard, of everything that had happened, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unknowns. But it was a road I would walk alone, without the weight of the past dragging me down. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward finding myself again. Leaving town was supposed to be the first step toward healing. But as I drove away from the house that had once been my home, the reality of what I had done weighed heavily on me. I had no destination in mind, no clear plan for what came next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in the place where my life had fallen apart. For the first few days, I wandered aimlessly, staying in cheap motels, eating at roadside diners, trying to figure out how to start over. The sense of freedom I had felt when I left quickly faded, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. The revenge I had taken on Megan and Richard had left me hollow, and now I was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding my life from the ground up. One evening, after a particularly long drive, I found myself in a small town a few hours away from this city. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where life moved at a slower pace. There was a sense of peace here that I hadn't felt in a long time, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I checked into a modest bed and breakfast run by an older couple, their warm smiles and welcoming demeanor a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal motels I had been staying in. The room was small but cozy, with a view of the mountains in the distance. As I sat on the bed, staring out at the sunset, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to take a walk around the town. It was a crisp autumn day, the air cool and refreshing. As I wandered through the streets, I found myself drawn to the local church, its steeple rising above the trees. It wasn't a place I had visited often in the past. Religion had never played a significant role in my life. But something about the quiet serenity of the church called to me. I stepped inside, the door creaking softly as it closed behind me. The interior was simple, with wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the floor. There was no one else around, just the quiet hum of the building and the faint scent of incense in the air. I sat down in one of the pews, my hands clasped together in my lap. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, what I hoped to find in this place. But as I sat there in the silence, the weight of everything that had happened began to lift, just a little. I didn't pray, not really. I just sat there, letting the quiet wash over me, letting the memories and regrets fade into the background. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to just be, to exist without the burden of anger, of revenge, of the past. When I finally left the church, the sun was high in the sky, and the town was coming to life. I walked back to the bed and breakfast, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The pain and betrayal were still there, but they didn't feel as overwhelming, as all-consuming. As the days passed, I settled into a routine. I spent my mornings walking through the town, exploring the nearby trails, and my afternoons sitting by the lake, watching the water ripple in the breeze. I found comfort in the simplicity of it all, in the quiet moments that allowed me to start healing. I thought a lot about Tyler and Jason during those days. I knew I couldn't stay away forever, that I had to go back and face the reality of what had happened. But I also knew that I needed this time to figure out who I was without the anger, without the need for revenge. I needed to be whole again before I could be the father they needed. One afternoon, as I sat by the lake, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I hadn't been checking it much. There was nothing I wanted to see, nothing I wanted to deal with. But something compelled me to pull it out this time, to see who was trying to reach me. It was a text from Megan. "I'm staying with my sister now. She's helping me get through this. I just wanted you to know that I've started going to therapy. I know it won't fix what I did, but I need to understand why I did it. I need to be better for the boys. I hope you're okay wherever you are. Please let me know if there's anything I can do. I'm so sorry, Eric." I stared at the message for a long time, the words blurring in front of my eyes. Therapy. It was something I had considered, something that had been recommended to me by a few well-meaning friends. But I had been too wrapped up in my anger, too focused on making Megan and Richard pay, to think about healing myself. But now, as I sat there by the lake, I realized that I couldn't do this alone. I couldn't rebuild my life, my relationship with my sons, without help. I needed to confront the pain, the anger, the betrayal, and find a way to move past it. I took a deep breath and typed out a response. "I'm glad you're getting help, Megan. I've been thinking a lot too. I think it's time for me to see someone as well. We both need to heal if we're going to be good parents for Tyler and Jason. I'll be back soon. We need to figure this out together, for their sake." I hesitated for a moment before hitting send, but then I did, feeling a strange sense of relief as I did. This wasn't about reconciliation, about trying to save something that was already gone. It was about healing, about finding a way to coexist for the sake of our children. When I returned to the bed and breakfast that evening, I made a call to a therapist in the city, someone who had been recommended to me by a colleague. It was the first step, a small one, but it felt significant. I needed to confront my demons, to understand the choices I had made, the path I had taken. The following week, I packed up my things and checked out of the bed and breakfast. The couple who ran the place wished me well, their warm smiles a reminder that there were still good, kind people in the world. As I drove back to the city, I felt a sense of purpose, a determination to face what came next with a clear mind and an open heart. When I returned home, the house felt different, less like a prison and more like a place where I could start anew. I reached out to Tyler and Jason, arranging to spend time with them that weekend. It wasn't going to be easy, explaining everything, but I knew I had to be honest with them, to help them understand what had happened in a way that wouldn't destroy their innocence. I also reached out to Megan, letting her know that I was back and that we needed to talk. She agreed, and we arranged to meet at a neutral location, a park where we could walk and talk without the weight of our shared history pressing down on us. When we met, she looked better than the last time I had seen her. Still tired, still worn, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. We walked in silence for a while, the autumn leaves crunching under our feet, before she finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "About what went wrong, about why I did what I did. And I realized that I was trying to fill a void that had nothing to do with you, or Richard, or anyone else. I was unhappy with myself, and instead of dealing with it, I tried to escape." I nodded, understanding what she meant. I had been doing the same thing in my own way, escaping into work, into anger, into revenge, trying to avoid the deeper issues that had been festering beneath the surface. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued, her eyes filled with tears. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I'm committed to getting better, to being the mother our boys need." "I believe you," I said softly, the anger that had once driven me now replaced with a deep sense of sadness. "We both need to heal, Megan. For them, if not for ourselves." She nodded, wiping away her tears. "I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in infidelity and self-worth. It's been hard, but I'm learning a lot about myself, about the mistakes I made, and I think I can become a better person through this." "I'm seeing someone too," I admitted, the words feeling like a confession. "I realized that I've been holding on to so much anger, so much pain, and it's been eating me alive. I don't want to be that person anymore." We walked in silence for a while longer, both of us lost in our thoughts. There was no easy solution, no quick fix to what had happened. But there was a path forward, a way to rebuild, not as a couple, but as two individuals who shared a common goal, the well-being of our children. "I think it's best if we separate," Megan said finally, her voice trembling. "I love you, Eric, but I know that I've destroyed too much for us to ever go back to what we were. I think we need to focus on being the best parents we can be, even if that means doing it separately." I nodded, the decision one that I had come to on my own as well. "I agree. We need to find a way to co-parent, to be there for Tyler and Jason, without the baggage of our past weighing us down." We sat down on a bench, the park quiet around us, and talked through the details, how we would split custody, how we would communicate, how we would support each other in raising our boys. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. When we finished, there was a sense of resolution between us, a mutual understanding that while our marriage was over, our roles as parents were just beginning. We parted ways with a tentative plan in place, one that would allow us to move forward, separately but still connected by our love for our children. As I drove home, I felt a strange mixture of emotions, sadness, relief, and a glimmer of hope. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. In the days that followed, I focused on my therapy, on rebuilding my relationship with Tyler and Jason, on finding a new normal. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of anger, of pain, of regret, but I was learning to face them head on, to deal with them in a healthy way. Megan and I continued to communicate, working together to ensure that our boys were happy and secure. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, the life I had once dreamed of, but it was a life that I could build on, a life that had the potential to be fulfilling in its own way. And as the weeks turned into months, I began to see that healing wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about acknowledging the pain, the mistakes, and finding a way to move forward with grace and forgiveness, for myself, for Megan, and for the future we were creating for our children. It was a long road, one that would take time and patience, but I was finally on it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to face whatever came next, with an open heart and a clear mind. The months that followed the resolution of my marriage with Megan were some of the most challenging yet transformative of my life. The process of rebuilding wasn't a straight path, but rather a series of ups and downs, small victories and setbacks, moments of clarity, and moments of doubt. But through it all, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of anger, betrayal, and revenge. One of the first major steps I took was moving out of the house. The memories it held, the good, the bad, and the ugly, were too overwhelming to live with day after day. Megan and I agreed that it would be best if she stayed there with Tyler and Jason, while I found a place nearby so I could be close to the boys. It was a difficult decision, but one that ultimately felt right. The house had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, and I needed a fresh start in a space that was my own. I found a modest apartment not far from their school, in a quiet neighborhood where I could begin to carve out a new life. It wasn't much, just a small 2-bedroom place with basic furnishings, but it was mine. It was a place where I could start to rebuild, piece by piece, without the constant reminders of what had been lost. The first night in my new apartment was strange and unsettling. The silence was deafening, and the empty rooms felt like a reflection of the emptiness I had been carrying inside. But I knew this was the first step towards something better, something healthier. I wasn't running away from my past. I was creating a new future. I threw myself into making the apartment a home, not just for me, but for Tyler and Jason as well. I set up a room for them, complete with bunk beds and posters of their favorite superheroes. I stocked the kitchen with their favorite snacks, filled the shelves with board games and books, and made sure there was a big screen TV for movie nights. It was a small space, but it was filled with love, and that was what mattered. The first weekend the boys stayed with me was a mix of emotions: excitement, nervousness, and a lingering sadness. They were hesitant at first, unsure of what to make of this new arrangement, but as the weekend wore on, I could see them beginning to relax, to feel at home in this new space. We spent the days exploring the neighborhood, playing catch at the nearby park, and cooking meals together in the tiny kitchen. At night, we huddled on the couch for movie marathons, laughing and talking like we hadn't in months. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was being the father they needed. I wasn't distracted by work, by anger, or by the need for revenge. I was present, fully engaged in their lives, and it felt good. Better than good. It felt right. The connection I had feared losing with my sons was stronger than ever, and I realized that despite everything, we were going to be okay. As time went on, the boys adjusted to the new normal. They spent weekdays with Megan and weekends with me, and while it wasn't the traditional family setup, it worked for us. Megan and I communicated regularly about their needs, their schoolwork, and their activities, maintaining a civil and cooperative relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension, but we both knew that our boys came first. We had to put aside our past for their sake. Therapy became a cornerstone of my healing process. I met with my therapist weekly, working through the anger, the pain, and the guilt that had consumed me for so long. We talked about the choices I had made, the actions I had taken in the name of revenge, and the toll they had taken on my soul. It wasn't about seeking absolution, but rather understanding why I had done what I had done, and finding a way to move forward. Through therapy, I began to understand the depth of my own wounds that went beyond Megan's betrayal. I realized that I had been carrying unresolved pain for years, pain that had festered and grown into something dark and destructive. By confronting it, by naming it, I was able to start the process of letting it go. I also began to forgive myself, not for what I had done, but for being human, for reacting out of pain and hurt. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how I moved forward. And that choice was to live a life rooted in kindness, compassion, and self-awareness. As the seasons changed, so did I. The anger that had once defined me began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet determination to build a life that was meaningful and fulfilling. I reconnected with old friends, joined a local hiking group, and started volunteering at a community center. I wasn't just filling my time. I was rediscovering my passions, my interests, the things that made me feel alive. One of the most surprising aspects of this new life was the sense of community I found in the small town where I had settled. The people here were kind and welcoming, and I quickly became involved in local events and activities. It was a far cry from the high-paced, competitive world I had left behind, and I found a sense of peace in the simplicity of it all. Tyler and Jason thrived in this environment as well. They made new friends, excelled in school, and found joy in the everyday adventures we embarked on together. Our relationship deepened, and I knew that despite the challenges, we were stronger as a family than ever before. Megan continued with her therapy, and while we rarely talked about the past, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We were both on a journey of healing, each in our own way, and while our paths had diverged, there was a mutual respect that had developed over time. She had become a better mother, more present and attentive, and I could see the effort she was making to rebuild her relationship with the boys. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the year came to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened: the pain, the betrayal, the revenge, and the eventual healing. It had been a long and difficult road, but I had come out the other side stronger, more self-aware, and more determined to live a life that was true to who I was. On New Year's Eve, I took the boys to a small cabin I had rented in the mountains. It was a place where we could disconnect from the world, surrounded by nature, with nothing but the stars above us. We spent the evening playing games, roasting marshmallows over the fire, and talking about our hopes for the future. As midnight approached, we bundled up in warm blankets and sat on the porch, watching the sky. The boys were excited, chattering about their resolutions and the things they wanted to do in the coming year. I listened, smiling, my heart filled with a quiet contentment. When the clock struck 12, we cheered, the sound echoing through the still night. I hugged Tyler and Jason, holding them close, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life we were building together. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was ours, and it was filled with love. After the boys went to bed, I stayed up, sitting by the fire, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The pain, the anger, the revenge. It had all been part of the process, part of the path that had led me to where I was now. I had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past, but about embracing it, learning from it, and allowing it to shape me into a better person. As I watched the flames dance in the fireplace, I felt a sense of closure, of peace. The wounds were still there, but they had begun to heal, and I knew that with time, they would continue to fade. I had found a new life, a life that was true to who I was, and for that, I was grateful. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of laughter. The boys were outside, playing in the snow, their joy infectious. I joined them, and we spent the day building snowmen, sledding down the hills, and making memories that would last a lifetime. And as I stood there, surrounded by the people I loved, I realized that I had finally found what I had been searching for: a sense of belonging, of purpose, of peace. My new life was one of simplicity, of connection, of love. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and it was enough. As we packed up to leave the cabin, I took one last look at the mountains, the snow-covered trees, the quiet beauty of the world around me. And in that moment, I knew that I was ready to embrace whatever came next, to face the future with an open heart and an unwavering belief in the power of forgiveness, healing, and love. My journey wasn't over, but I was finally on the right path, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace.